Well, good morning. I think it's still morning everywhere that we're broadcasting to. Glad to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about cybersecurity, and we'll be talking about it mostly from the data protection and on that side of things. But as you know, cybersecurity impacts a lot of different products as well in the med device space. So we'll have a little bit of discussion on that as well. A little bit about me, and we'll find our clicker here. My background's in privacy and cybersecurity law. I've worked on HIPAA implementation, compliance, GDPR, other state and federal privacy laws, a lot of auditing, program implementation, various things in both privacy and cybersecurity. Today, our goal is ultimately to walk away with a better understanding of the landscape around cybersecurity, what's happening in the life sciences industry, the med device industry in terms of cybersecurity, and then further get into some specific impact on M&A that this may have or does have. And then also, what are some ways to avoid pitfalls that might come into play during due diligence or M&A transactions that are driven by cybersecurity risk. And then we'll also go through briefly some examples of questions or due diligence requests that we might see, whether it's from the sell side and trying to anticipate what those requests would be, or ways to look at this from the buyer side. So what's going on in cybersecurity right now for life sciences companies? Obviously, there is no difficulty in looking around the news and finding examples of data breaches, and life sciences is no exception to that. We have breach upon breach and some very significant ones over the past year or two. And I just want to highlight these. And I think one thing that's important to remember is these companies are not always at fault. They're often victims, and generally are victims of attacks from cyber criminals who are very experienced, hardened experts in this area. And there's nation states and very difficult challenges in defending against these attacks. So this is not to point the finger at any companies, but to simply outline some of the things that have happened and try to learn from that to better protect our companies going forward. So one example last year that was very significant was a data breach at Zoll Medical, and this involved email compromise, so not systems of the company that were processing data in a kind of organized way, but emails. So this came through an email phishing attack. There was a loss of data through that affected potentially around 1 million individuals based on a submission to the Massachusetts through a cybersecurity reporting report to the Massachusetts government. So this is just one example of a breach, and the impact is ongoing, as these typically take some time, not only to remediate, to investigate, to prepare, experts, bring in forensic folks to look through the data and evaluate what's happened, where did the access extend to, contain the breach, and then notify all these individuals, notify regulators, stakeholders, shareholders. And then once you're done with that, you still have the work of shoring up your company's security to improve and remediate from that point forward. And on top of that, there's business impacts, whether that's interruption in business, or it could be even things like lost revenue from a loss of trust or lack of trust from customers. So there's a lot of impacts that tail off of these that presumably would occur in this case as well. Another major breach was last October. LivaNova had about a month-long period from October to November before a breach was discovered. And once that was discovered, the containment process and investigation process began. And it was about 6 months until it was confirmed that patient information was breached during this this incident as well. A very significant impact. We don't have, as we typically is the case, we don't have a number on the total business impact, but disclosed by LivaNova in the Q4 financial filings, we can glean that there was a direct impact of about $2.6 million in that one quarter following the breach discovery. And obviously since then, no doubt there's additional costs incurred through notifications and all of those investigative processes and business impact, et cetera. And then another breach we can discuss briefly is the Henry Schein breach that affected about 29,000 individuals. Now, this breach in particular had a business interruption element that was discussed quite a bit in the news around this. And also something interesting here is that the company started to offer discounts on their products in order to directly, following the breach, help continue sales. Some finance analysts were estimating there may have been an impact of around 500 million in total revenue to this company through that incident. So again, not to point the finger at anyone, these are just examples of some very significant risks that cybersecurity vulnerabilities or even just attacks in general can have. And the obvious impact to M&A is that these directly impact valuation. They directly impact reputation of companies, whether it's an acquiring company following a breach, or if a breach occurs shortly after an acquisition, perhaps the company that's assigned responsibility becomes the acquiring company. So there are definitely some implications for M&A, and we've seen that historically through, for example, the Verizon acquisition of Yahoo a number of years ago. There was a direct discount when a breach was discovered in the middle of a transaction of about 8% of the valuation. So these do have direct impacts on valuation during acquisitions. Another area that this can have an impact is devices and safety and effectiveness of those devices. So cybersecurity in this context is a little bit different, right? This isn't about protecting the company information from outsiders, but protecting a particular product, whether that product is a cloud connected product or a more isolated programmable implant, something like that. In any event, these are all devices that have cybersecurity risk. And so it's critical to recognize having a process in place, having systems in place to defend and protect that product, anticipate risk is critical. These are actually examples, I think, in a positive light of companies proactively identifying we have a vulnerability here that we've noted through our systematic process, whether that's internal activity or they're paying attention to outside input on those vulnerabilities. However that's discovered, these are examples of companies proactively addressing that. So we see the example here of Medtronic self-disclosing to the FDA and anticipating we have this vulnerability, here's how we're addressing it, and ensuring that patient safety is supported through self-disclosure and anticipation of that risk. Similarly, BD had another similar approach. We identified cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and this is what we did to address it. The reason I raise these is because think about this in terms of an M&A transaction. You're looking at a company, they have a device that's connected, so there's cybersecurity concerns or issues that could come up. Well, do they have a process in place that anticipates these? Is there a risk assessment that's documented? Was that put in a file after submission and forgotten about, or are they still continuing to evaluate what risks are present now? Are we patching this device? Are those things continuing? These are ways that this could impact M&A directly. So let's talk about the impact a little further. So what about cybersecurity in terms of if versus when? I think a lot of times we think of cybersecurity as well, if there's a breach or if there's an issue that comes up, But in M&A, I think a better way to think about this is what will we find or what is there and do we know about it? Every single system, every company has some vulnerabilities. Think of it a little bit like the body's immune system. Security and cybersecurity are risk-based practices. They're not black and white rules that protect a company or a product from any vulnerability or threat. It's a constant flowing give and take of preparation and then exploitation and trying to anticipate where is the exploitation going to occur and getting there first, and preparing your systems or your software to deflect that. So if you're doing due diligence and you identify 0 cybersecurity issues, you've probably missed something, and there's probably some risk that's been missed. So think about it from that perspective and attempt to find where is that risk up front. Recognize that the average cost of a breach, and this is again, not the business impact, but specifically when we have a breach and we have to respond to that and then investigate it, mitigate that, and do reporting. The cost of a breach in healthcare is approximately about 9.8 million in the US right now, based on a IBM report that's an annual report they publish on data breach costs. The cost per record, and this isn't healthcare specific, but is generally around $180 per record. So there's a significant cost directly from breaches, not even mentioning business impact like we noted in that previous example with some of the companies that have experienced these breaches. And then on top of that, if you're on the selling side, cybersecurity is a trending M&A area of scrutiny. So we're seeing questions on this pretty consistently. And I'll pause. We have a question, it looks like.
A couple questions. First, do you know, has there ever been a malicious attack on embedded device software? And what is your view on the risk that poses? Once again, that's a malicious attack on embedded device software.
Yeah, and if you could clarify embedded device, meaning you have an implant and there's software that supports that device directly, or I'll assume that's probably the case. To date, we haven't actually seen an attack on a person's device that we've identified as causing harm to date. There have been concerns about that. You can think of the Dick Cheney example a number of years ago, where his I think it was a pacemaker or some similar device, defibrillator perhaps. They were concerned someone might get next to him with do some sort of direct interference with that device. We haven't seen someone interfere with the programming in a way that we've identified and noted as a cyber attack.
Does the FDA's enhanced guidance on cybersecurity for devices and software as a medical device improve the ability to do diligence on acquisition targets?
I think so. What is helpful about those guidances, especially the last couple of years, is that there's a more specific framework to compare to. I think in the past, it was definitely a part of the safety and effectiveness process to, hey, we have risk assessment, we look at software, bill of materials, or other things to try to identify risk. But having a framework to say, do you have this particular kind of documentation in place is helpful, definitely. So yes, these are definitely good questions, and feel free to ask more as we go. So increased scrutiny is a thing. We are seeing more questions about cybersecurity as we move forward. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is cost, but also resources. So when we have a cybersecurity issue that's identified, let's assume even if a breach hasn't occurred, but we find a vulnerability. This should affect valuation. It will affect remediation once the acquisition occurs, and there will be integration costs that are increased if the cybersecurity posture of the target company is not on par with the company acquiring it, which is very common in deals where it's a smaller, less sophisticated company. Usually the target company carries very little cybersecurity risk in terms of a breach because once the acquisition is complete, um, their reputation isn't on the line. They don't have the sophistication and cybersecurity controls that that acquiring company typically would have. So there should be impacts to valuation. Remediation costs should be taken into account, the effort, the resources, and the integration costs. And another thing that's interesting is there's been a trend of increased threat. So when a deal is announced, companies are seeing increased activity or attempts um, to breach their networks and systems after a deal is announced. And presumably that's because criminals are seeing this as they are in transition. There's some changes occurring. There might be staff transitions or layoffs or other things that occur around that deal that might impact cybersecurity preparedness or even integration work that leads to reprogramming or changes to the systems that again could increase those vulnerabilities, and then therefore the threat is increased. So going back to the point about it's not so much an if, but it's a what is vulnerable. I think tied with this increased threat, there's a significant risk to be concerned about. So just for a moment, let's do a poll and ask, so if you're on the acquiring side or on the selling side, are you seeing cybersecurity in diligence requests, or are you using cybersecurity? So if you've seen it, raise your hand here. Otherwise, you can answer the poll online. I see a few, yeah, a couple in the audience, but yeah, we've definitely been seeing that regularly, even sometimes when it seems out of left field for the product that's being acquired. Any?
Right now, it's yeah, 71% have seen it in the
Okay.
article online.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. So it is a major area of scrutiny, especially right now when products have any connectedness to the internet, or if there's significant patient information being collected, it becomes a major area. Whether that's through patient education programs and pipelines, direct to consumer kind of marketing, or reimbursement programs and hubs, things like that tend to increase risk around data breaches and so forth. So what are some pitfalls to avoid? You know, obviously take it seriously. Cybersecurity is a significant risk area in this space. We've already talked about some of these areas of cost. And also there are a lot of regulators that are directly involved in cybersecurity. So that comes from, you know, the FTC has been very active on the cybersecurity enforcement front. We're seeing numerous cases where they're taking action on after breaches, or even just when there's some more run-of-the-mill privacy issues. But in cybersecurity particularly, it's post-breach. State attorney general involvement. We're seeing obviously in HIPAA, the HHS may become involved, especially post-breach, in determining fines and so forth. One I'd note too is the Security Exchange Commission is becoming more engaged when it comes to transparency around cybersecurity incidents and the impact on finances and so forth. So filings with the SEC are definitely something to consider whenever dealing with cybersecurity risks and incidents. Then, of course, understand the target that you're dealing with. So if you have so much of a budget to do due diligence, you know, take a risk-based approach and understand what is the industry. So where are the key risk areas? Is there a patient database? Is there a CRM that has a significant amount of patient data? Are there products that are connected or have other key risk areas when it comes to cybersecurity? So take a risk-based approach, look at the areas that really are the most significant in terms of risk. And then again, assume some vulnerabilities that you identify may be exploited. Just because a breach hasn't been identified already or occurred yet does not mean that the risk is zero. Those things can take place. And as we saw in one of the examples early on from the news, there's the potential for months to go by without a breach actually being confirmed. and that can be just as damaging or even more damaging. If you look at these IBM cost reports, the costs are actually increased when companies take longer to identify breaches. So these controls that need to be in place can significantly mitigate the costs as well. A few other things. So as we mentioned, no breach does not equal no risk. So it's really difficult to be certain, especially if you don't have the controls in place, that someone's entered a system, right? If the logging is not set up to identify unusual access patterns, you might not even know, even months or even a year later, that someone's been in the system until you get that ransomware attack or notification from the FBI that we found your data on the dark web or something like that. Consider alternative methods for vetting targets. So you might consider hiring firms that can support, say, a dark web search or some other activity to look for signs of a breach within the target. For example, there are forums on the dark web where a criminal can post, I found data from X company, here's how much it costs to buy the records. If that is the case, you may have someone who can help you find that kind of information and confirm, is this real data or is it a fake posting, those kinds of things as well. And then also along with that, in that same vein, take a multidisciplinary approach to diligence. So legal is important to have at the table to look at some of those kind of basic risks. We can ask the questions, look at the policies, help identify the scope, maybe look at contracts, especially if it's a service provider business that needs to allocate risk for cybersecurity issues through contract, but also get the CISO involved or other cybersecurity professionals, IT. Think about architecture. How do these integrations work to make sure security is established throughout the whole deal? And then engineering or security professionals who understand the device. If there's a device involved or a connected device, get the right people at the table to look at that and understand, are there potential safety or effectiveness issues that could come from a cybersecurity perspective? So wrapping up here, and I think we've got just a couple minutes here. Here's some example requests that you might use, and not exhaustive, but some things that might help you identify some of these risks or lines of inquiry that you could use to dig deeper from there. But things like looking for documentation demonstrating that the company does have a functioning information security program, or on the device side, is there documentation of a total product lifecycle approach to cybersecurity? So from release to how do we sunset this device ultimately to deal with cybersecurity issues on that end? Do we continue to monitor cybersecurity throughout the life of the device? All of these things are relevant to evaluating cybersecurity risk during an M&A transaction. Some more example requests. So for example, a big area of risk in cybersecurity right now is software development. So if your company or the target company is developing software, there could be some areas within that development process that leave vulnerabilities. That's a very common attack vector is software development, because really it's coding, and any coding that's especially in-house, it may not be tested the same way that it might be if it's produced by off the shelf like Salesforce or Amazon, some of these organizations that have huge amounts of resources to dedicate to software development. So these are areas that can be very vulnerable. So looking at the software development process can be very critical to understanding the cybersecurity risk at the target company. Or if you're on the sell side, do you have these processes in place? Are you thinking about cybersecurity not only from a safety and effectiveness standpoint, which is, I think, common, to focus there first as a product development enterprise, but then also, is the data protected? Does our company have the right systems in place to protect from a data breach, like we noted early in the presentation? So again, these are just some examples, but there could be more areas of questioning if needed, or you could focus specifically on these things. So to wrap up, just to again, there's a lot of risk when it comes to cybersecurity. There could be a breach at any time in any company, but there are ways to mitigate those risks, and there's some proven ways to really reduce the risks. So taking into account particularly how you invest and think about how you invest in terms of your diligence uh, resources. I think cybersecurity does deserve some of that, and take some consideration around who should be at the table for these conversations. Who do you need to talk to at the target company to get a good picture of their cybersecurity posture? And then remember, data breaches, these are the tip of the iceberg, but cybersecurity is so much more than that. Um, there could be vulnerabilities that are under the surface, and this is what diligence is designed to find. Take a risk-based approach. There's only so much available, as you all know, if you've done work in this area, to investigate and look into a company from a diligence perspective. So take a risk-based approach, understand what are you looking at and what are the key risk areas, and deploy the right experts. Make sure that it's not just legal or it's not just IT, but there's a blend of the right um, sorts of expertise at the table to look at all these issues. And then lastly, again, I want to remind you to think about this from a vulnerabilities that are identified or not identified could be more likely to be exploited following a transaction announcement. So keep that in mind, that typical threat may be increased beyond the base threshold simply because of the M&A activity involved. So pause there. Any questions or more questions from the audience or from you guys?
You said have cyber liability insurance certificate. So do companies purchase insurance to save themselves from the data breaches and all those?
Yes, yeah. So more and more common now is this concept of cyber liability insurance. So if you have any sort of personal data or even company data that's at risk of breach, which is pretty much every company now, you can go and purchase a liability coverage policy that covers that. Typically, there's parameters that go along or requirements that come along with that will be imposed by the insurance company. So you have to meet a bare minimum of cybersecurity requirements to even get the policy, but those do help cover from breaches.